There's a reason your body tenses before your mind even processes what you're looking at. What if fear was designed into you? Think about the last time you scrolled past something that made you uncomfortable. Maybe it was a particular geometric pattern. Maybe it was an image used in horror content. Maybe it was a symbol you couldn't name, but instinctively avoided. Your finger moved faster. Your attention shifted. You didn't stop to analyze why. You just knew you didn't want to see it. That reaction happened in milliseconds, faster than conscious thought, faster than rational evaluation. Your nervous system responded to a visual cue that carried no physical threat, yet your body treated it like danger. Heart rate elevated, pupils dilated, stress hormones released, all for an image on a screen. Why does a shape, a drawing, a configuration of lines trigger the same biological response as an actual predator? Because fear doesn't need to be rational to be real, and symbols don't need to be understood to be powerful. What matters is the story that's been attached to them, the narrative that's been repeated so many times, across so many generations, that it's become embedded in collective memory. You inherit these reactions the same way you inherit language patterns, cultural reflexes, unconscious biases. No one sat you down and explained why certain symbols should frighten you. You absorbed it through exposure. This is how symbolic conditioning works. An image appears repeatedly in contexts associated with punishment, chaos, transgression, loss of control. Religious texts warn against it. Authority figures condemn it. Stories use it to represent evil. Films deploy it to signal danger. Over time, the symbol becomes inseparable from the emotional charge surrounding it. The meaning gets coded directly into your nervous system. But here's what almost no one notices. The symbol itself carries no inherent power. It's neutral, just ink, just pixels, just form. What gives it force is the accumulated weight of human projection. Centuries of fear, guilt, prohibition, all compressed into a single visual marker, and that compression makes it extraordinarily efficient as a control mechanism. When a symbol triggers automatic fear, it bypasses critical thinking entirely. You react before you question. You reject before you investigate. And that reflex can be weaponized. It can be used to mark boundaries between acceptable and forbidden, between us and them, between safety and threat, all without a single word being spoken. If this kind of analysis resonates with you, subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. How power structures manufacture symbolic threat. Throughout history, dominant institutions have understood something crucial about human psychology. People unite more effectively against a common enemy than toward a shared vision. And the most powerful enemies are symbolic ones, because they can be shapes to represent whatever threat serves the narrative at that moment. Look at how witchcraft was constructed as existential danger during the European witch trials. It wasn't just about individual practitioners. It was about creating a category of ultimate transgression. Anyone accused of witchcraft wasn't just breaking rules. They were aligned with cosmic evil. Their tools became weapons. Their knowledge became corruption. Their symbols became marks of damnation. Pentagrams, ritual circles, certain herbs, specific animals. All were rebranded as instruments of darkness. And this wasn't random. Many of these symbols existed in older traditions with completely different meanings. The pentagram, for instance, had been used as a protective emblem, representing harmony and elemental balance. It wasn't malevolent. It was sacred in its own context. But when a new power structure needed to consolidate authority, it had to delegitimize what came before. The most effective way to do that wasn't through logical argument. It was through emotional association. Take the symbols of the old ways, link them to fear and punishment, repeat that linkage until it becomes automatic, and you've effectively erased an entire knowledge system without having to disprove a single idea. This is where it gets unsettling. The fear you feel towards certain symbols isn't necessarily protecting you from anything real. It's protecting a narrative. It's maintaining a boundary that was constructed centuries ago for reasons that had nothing to do with your safety and everything to do with control. Consider what happens when you grow up in a culture where these associations are already fully formed. You don't need to be taught explicitly. You absorb them through ambient cultural exposure. children's stories that depict certain symbols as evil, movies that use them as visual shorthand for danger, news coverage that treats specific imagery as inherently threatening. You're being conditioned without realizing conditioning is happening. And the most effective part, once the association is established, it becomes self-reinforcing. People avoid the symbol, which means they never investigate its actual history. They never question whether the fear serves them or serves a system that benefits from their fear. The symbol remains dangerous precisely because it remains unexplored. Drop a comment if this framework is shifting how you see things. That interaction actually helps the content reach more people. Why forbidden knowledge always carries fear. Carl Jung identified something he called the shadow, the part of individual and collective psyche that contains everything deemed unacceptable. It's not evil in an absolute sense. It's simply everything that doesn't fit the approved narrative. The desires you're not supposed to have. The questions you're not supposed to ask. The power you're not supposed to claim. When something gets pushed into the shadow, it doesn't disappear. It gains intensity. It becomes distorted, exaggerated, monstrous. And symbols associated with the shadow inherit that distortion. They become representations not of what they actually are, but of what a culture fears most about itself. This is why occult traditions, esoteric practices, and alternative spiritual paths have been historically persecuted. Not because they were inherently harmful, but because they represented autonomy, knowledge accessed outside official channels, power claimed without institutional permission, spiritual experience without mediators. All of that threatens systems built on controlled access to truth. When someone can connect directly with forces larger than themselves, when they can pursue understanding outside sanctioned structures, when they can develop personal power independent of external validation, control becomes harder to maintain. And so those paths must be made terrifying. Their symbols must trigger visceral rejection. Their practitioners must be depicted as dangerous, deluded, or damned. Only here's the detail most people miss. When you collectively repress something, you amplify its symbolic power. What's forbidden becomes fascinating. What's condemned becomes compelling. The shadow grows precisely because it's denied, and the symbols linked to it accumulate. All that repressed energy. This is why certain imagery still provokes such strong reactions. These aren't just shapes. They're emotional portals to everything a culture has rejected. Looking at them means symbolically confronting the collective shadow. And that generates fear because it threatens to reveal what's supposed to stay hidden. The fear isn't about the symbol. It's about what acknowledging that symbol might mean. It might mean questioning authority. It might mean recognizing that forbidden doesn't always equal wrong. It might mean discovering that you've been kept from certain knowledge deliberately, not protectively. If this content is helping you see patterns you hadn't noticed before, hit the like button. That helps the channel continue bringing this level of analysis. The neuroscience behind symbolic terror. Your brain processes symbols through both conscious and unconscious pathways. When you encounter an image culturally coded as dangerous, the amygdala activates before your prefrontal cortex can evaluate whether the threat is real. This happens in roughly 200 milliseconds. Your body responds to learned associations, not objective danger. This mechanism evolved to keep humans alive. Quick reactions to threat signals increased survival odds. See a shape associated with predators, react immediately, ask questions later. But in modern contexts, this same mechanism can be exploited. Symbols carrying emotional charge become tools of behavioral influence because they trigger responses faster than conscious thought. Media industries understand this completely. Horror films don't create new fear symbols from scratch. They deploy ones already loaded with centuries of negative association. Inverted crosses, specific numerical patterns, occult imagery, all of it leverages existing cultural conditioning. The filmmaker doesn't need to explain why it's threatening. The audience has already been programmed. Political movements use identical strategies. A symbol gets repeatedly linked to chaos, moral decay, or existential threat until it becomes a marker of danger itself. Anyone opposing that symbol automatically positions themselves as defenders of order, safety, righteousness. No logical argument required. The symbol does the emotional labor. On social platforms, algorithms prioritize content generating strong emotional response. Fear is among the most viral emotions. When something triggers immediate discomfort, people share to warn others, express outrage, publicly reject it. The symbol spreads precisely because it's rejected, and the more it spreads, the more it reinforces its own negative charge. But here's what changes everything. If fear is culturally inherited and maintained through repetition, it can be dismantled the same way. Awareness interrupts automaticity. When you recognize the reaction isn't organically yours, that it was installed through external narratives, the symbol loses leverage. It doesn't become powerless, but it stops controlling you. This doesn't mean all symbols are neutral or that historical context doesn't matter. Some have been used in genuinely destructive ways. Some carry marks of violence, manipulation, abuse. Acknowledging that is important. But it's equally important to distinguish between the symbol itself and the intentions projected onto it. What remains when fear becomes conscious? Imagine encountering a symbol that's always made you uncomfortable. But this time, instead of automatically looking away, you observe your reaction. You notice the tension in your chest, the impulse to reject, the mental narrative that immediately labels it as wrong, dangerous, forbidden. And then you ask, where did this certainty come from? Who taught me to feel this way? The answer is rarely found in your direct experience. It's in stories you heard, films you watched, warnings you received, cultural atmospheres you absorbed without questioning. The fear was built incrementally, repetition by repetition, until it felt native. But native and inherited aren't the same thing. When you recognize this distinction, something shifts. The symbol doesn't become harmless. It still carries history, still activates collective memory, but you're no longer passive. Before it, the automatic response weakens. You gain space to choose your relationship to it, and that choice, however small it seems, represents recovered agency. Numerous spiritual and esoteric traditions throughout history have used symbols to access altered states of consciousness, mark internal transformation, represent invisible forces shaping human experience. These symbols weren't inherently malevolent. They were technologies of meaning, and like any technology, they could be applied differently depending on who wielded them and toward what end. What's happening now is that we live in an era where symbols circulate faster than ever. Social media, memes, visual campaigns, all depend on instant recognition. And emotionally loaded symbols have algorithmic advantage because they generate immediate engagement. They provoke, they divide, they make people react before thinking. But that same velocity can serve different purposes. When awareness about these mechanisms spreads, it begins deactivating collective conditioning. Not completely, overnight, but gradually. Each person who recognizes the pattern becomes less susceptible to symbolic manipulation. And at scale, that shifts power dynamics. Symbols only control those who don't see them operating. When you perceive the structure behind your reaction, when you realize the fear was installed rather than inherent, something fundamental changes. You can still choose to avoid certain symbols. You can decide they're not aligned with your path. But now, it's conscious choice, not unconscious obedience. The question isn't whether symbols have power. They do. The question is whether that power comes from within them or from the narratives built around them, and more importantly, whether you're aware enough to distinguish between the two. If this video opened your perception to patterns operating beneath conscious awareness, subscribe to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss what comes next. Comment which part hit hardest. This kind of analysis only matters if it generates real reflection.